And tonight is one of those nights, and it's midway through the chapter. So we're going to cover chapter 15 tonight with an emphasis on sin. The first, basically half of this chapter, the first 21 verses, are all about offerings. Now, the Israelites had specific offerings on specific appointed feasts. You go back to Leviticus chapter 23 and Passover, Pentecost, these three feasts that we typically think of that are listed there, the Sabbaths that went along with them. If I am not mistaken, of course, every seventh day was a Sabbath for the Israelites, but then with the accompanying feasts throughout the year, I believe there ends up being a total of 59, what they refer to as Sabbaths, not just the calendar 52. So it's interesting to note all that information. So you have that mentioned here, these offerings of the appointed feasts in verse 3. But you could offer a free will offering. You could offer a vow, or you could take a vow, and with that vow you were required to make an offering. Just for instance, we looked at back in Numbers chapter 6, the Nazirite vow. And there were specific sacrifices for that. So it's kind of like the Sabbaths. You have the required feasts, you have the required sacrifices, but then again in verse 3 you have the sacrifice to fulfill a vow or a free will offering. This idea of tithing, just for instance, tithing is an Old Testament principle, giving of a tenth. But there's much more to it than just a tenth. When you total all the sacrifices, when you total all the offerings, it's much more than just a tenth. So all of this stuff would be considered part of what they would give back. We also learn in these first several verses about drink offerings. And the first drink offering, it's in the book of Genesis. I can't remember what chapter. I want to say chapter 34, but the first time drink offerings are mentioned would be in the book of Genesis. Of course, that predates the law of Moses. So this is not a new development, let's say, in human history. But you have specific drink offerings that were poured out too. And that's an interesting thing about the drink offerings. Somebody turn over real quick, 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 6. The drink offerings were poured out to God. They were not consumed by the one offering them. And Paul, the stock of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, concerning the law, a Pharisee of the strictest sect. He excelled everybody, every one of his peers. He excelled them in what he was doing as a Pharisee. So this man knows the sacrificial system. Somebody read 2 Timothy 4:6. Okay. Somebody read it from the New King James. It's a libation. That's the word. It's an offering that's poured out. I'm ready to be offered up. King James says, I'm being poured out as a drink offering. It's what the literal meaning of that term is. So we learn about these drink offerings. One of the interesting studies in the Hebrew, or in the Old Testament, which was largely written in the Hebrew language, is all the different uses or all the different terms that are translated as wine. There's something like 10 or 12 different words. Context will always tell you what they mean. There are only 2 words in the New Testament that are translated as wine, and once again, context will tell you what it means. But you have that mentioned here in Numbers chapter 15 and verses 1 through 21. I don't really want to spend a lot of time on that because we've talked a lot about sacrifice and all of that. These are just further sacrifices. You do have something in verses 11 through 16, that the specifications were both for native-born and strangers. God had one law for the Jewish nation, but also for the strangers who would dwell among them. And when you read through your Old Testament, and you read about strangers, particularly, again, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, talking about the Gentiles, okay? Those who were not born Jewish, but converted, if you want to use that word, to Judaism. They had to keep the same law. Verses 17 through 21, a heave offering. We studied that in the book of Leviticus. That's your first blank here tonight. The heave offering refers to the way this offering was handled. So basically, it was a portion of what they were sacrificing, and the offerer would heave it up he would raise it up to God with his hands and bring it back down. So far as I can tell, representing that whoever the offerer was recognizing that it came from God and was given to him as a blessing. And this portion of that sacrifice was given to the priests. And I give you a whole list of verses there, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Because again, as we talked about the priesthood, the tribe of the Levites, they didn't receive a land inheritance. They got the cities around Jerusalem. They inherited the services of the tabernacle/temple. And part of those offerings were for them were for their support, you might say. Any questions or comments on all of that? I really don't have a lot to add to that. I wanted to spend a majority of our time tonight starting with verse 22. Okay. Interesting passage here. Beginning in verse 22, the King James says, "And if ye have erred," E-R-R-E-D, "and not observed all these commandments." The New King James says, "If you sin unintentionally and do not observe all these commandments." So this is one of those texts where you have the word in the original and the translators make a choice. Again, translation, the process of translation is, I would call it a science, but it's also, the word I would use would be kind of an art, because you can't always bring a exact word-for-word definition into another language. And so you have one version says, "If you have erred," one version says, "If you have sinned unintentionally." But what it means is this, the next phrase explains that. "And do not observe all these commandments." So the first section here, verses 22 through 26, congregational, unintentional sins. All right? The Hebrew word here means to stray, to go astray, to wander, again, or to err, as the King James says. This word is used in contrast with presumptuous sin. Now that's down in verses 30 and 31, and the presumptuous sin literally means to shoot out the hand. Some versions actually render it high-handed. If you sin with a high hand, in other words, I know this is a sin, I know it violates God's law, and I'm going to do it anyway. So there's a major difference between wandering or committing an error versus an intentional sin. So the text again defines unintentional sin as the congregation not observing God's commands. And so in that parentheses in your outline, write the word omission. O-M-I-S-S-I-O-N. Sins of omission. It's not that you're intentionally violating God's revealed will, it's that you've left something out. Can you think of a New Testament passage that addresses what we would refer to as unintentional sin or sins of omission? I can think of one off the top of my head. Somebody turn over to James 4 and read, just read verses 15 through 17, please. James 4, 15 through 17. All right. That would fall under the category, in my opinion, of an unintentional sin. You're just going through life, making your plans. You're not intending to go out and steal something. You're not intending to go out and murder somebody. It's just, I've got plans for tomorrow. I'm going to do those plans. And James' lesson is, it starts back up in verse 13, your life is a vapor. You need to include God in your plans. And if you're not used to doing that, if you're not used to making your plans and thinking or even verbalizing it, if the Lord wills, because that's what that passage says, you're sinning unintentionally. Again, it's not a high-handed, rebellious spirit that you have. So as I was thinking about that, you go down a couple of bullet points. Okay, examples. Holding a grudge might be an unintentional sin. Somebody has wronged you. Say a fellow member of the church has wronged you, but they reconcile. They make it right. But you're just, I'm going to keep them at arm distance. I'm going to keep, let's say it this, I'm going to keep them on probation. I'm going to put them to the test. And it's not that you're formulating that thought in your mind. It's just, okay, they burned me once. I don't want that to happen again, and so I'm not going to treat them maybe the way I ought to treat them. Again, you're not intending to shun them or anything like that, or then go around and talk about them to everybody else. It's just something that you do as you're trying to manage that situation, let's say. Losing your temper, that can happen unintentionally. We can get mad quickly and, as it's been said, blow your stack. It's not that you're in a situation and you're dealing with someone and you're intending to just, as we say, go off on somebody, but in the moment, you're caught up in the moment and you lose it, as we say. That's not an intentional sin. Gossip, that can be an intentional sin, but it can also be unintentional. Gossip is a willful, what would you say, attack on someone's reputation to others. We can talk about situations, we can talk about people without it being gossip. But it can become gossip. And it can become gossip unintentionally. But there are people who that's what they live for. 1 Thessalonians chapter, is it 1 Thessalonians 4? 2 Thessalonians 3 talks about it, I know that. Let's do this. Go to 1 Thessalonians chapter. Actually, I think it's chapter 3. No, I was right. It's 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Look at this text here. Starts in verse 9. 1 Thessalonians 4:9. But concerning brotherly love, you have no need that I should write to you, for you yourselves are taught by God to love one another, and indeed you do so toward all the brethren who are in Macedonia. But we urge you, brethren, that you increase more and more, that you aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business. We don't always do that, do we? Mind your business. Work with your own hands, as we commanded you, that you may walk properly towards those who are outside, and that you may lack nothing. And again, Paul also talks about over in 2 Thessalonians about busybodies in other men's matters. They're trying to manage the affairs of other people. You can do that intentionally, no doubt, but it can also happen unintentionally. Conversations can go too far and you don't say anything to stop it. It can become unintentional. Laziness. Whatever you do, Colossians 4 says, do it heartily as unto the Lord. I'd say we've all been guilty of that from time to time. We just take things for granted and we just get lazy. It's not that we're intending to be neglectful or lazy. It just, sometimes we don't give what we ought to when we're trying to do what we're supposed to be doing. Any thoughts or questions on all of that stuff? Okay. So let's go back to Numbers 15. Somebody read for us verses 22 through, make it just 22 and 23. All right, go ahead. Read the first part of verse 24 there too.
Then it shall be, if aught be committed by ignorance without the knowledge of the congregation.
Okay. Committed by ignorance, and the congregation doesn't know about it. That is the congregation of Israel. So the congregation, while an individual may do this verses 22 through 26 is the congregation of Israel as a whole, failing to meet God's requirements as revealed in the law. It can come to your knowledge. It can be revealed. And when it's revealed, when they learned of it, well, here's the offering that you offer. That's the rest of verse 24, and it goes down through verse 26. And you will notice. So again, if you're looking at a New King James, for instance, verse 22, unintentionally. Verse 24, unintentionally. Verse 25, twice. Verse 26, twice. But then you see in verse 25, when you make atonement, it will be forgiven. And then verse 26, it shall be forgiven the whole congregation of the children of Israel. So while you have individual responsibility, the congregation at large could sin against God too. And sacrifice was required. So your next blank here, the congregation is presented as having failed to do something God required, verse 26. And again, it's the same law for the Jews and for the strangers who were dwelling among the Jewish people. So, typically, when we think of sin, I would say, and I'm speaking for all of us here, so I would say typically, when we think of sin, we think of something that you actually do. Would you agree with that? Some act that you actually commit that violates God's law. You name it, whatever it might be. But what we have to understand is that both covenants, both the covenant of Moses and the covenant of Christ, talk about what we would call unintentional sins. Again, not a high-handed, arrogant, I know what God says, but I'm going to do this other thing anyway kind of sin. It's just unintentional. Any questions or comments on all of that? One of the things I think we ought to learn is that we can do that. And so you have admonitions in the New Testament of, well, for instance, you have several admonitions for the Christian to be sober, to be serious-minded. The Christian walks intentionally. In other words, the Christian life is intentional. It's like Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5. See that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. That's Ephesians 5, 15 and 16. Circumspectly means the idea is like you have your head on a swivel, and it's holding yourself accountable. It's examining yourself. 2 Corinthians 13:5, examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. You don't just accidentally live the Christian life. Maybe that's a good way to think about it. Now, you can accidentally sin. I believe that. You can unintentionally sin. But the Christian life is no accident. You're not born into Christianity. You have to be born again. And you don't just happen to stumble into the Christian lifestyle. You don't stumble into producing the fruit of the Spirit. The Christian life is intentional. All right? So we need to be aware of that. And we need to be aware, one of the things I wanted us to think about tonight is the seriousness of sin. Because sin in our world is, how do I say that? Well, yeah, it's not sin. You're just living your truth. I wouldn't do that, but hey, you do you. And yeah, relativism. Everything's relative. Everything is subjective. So we have the responsibility as Christians, again, going back to Ephesians 5, you are light, walk as children of light. Find out what is acceptable to the Lord, Ephesians 5 and verse 10. Walk circumspectly and not as fools. The Christian life is intentional, not accidental. And sin will cost you your soul. That's part of walking circumspectly, understanding that. Any thoughts or questions on that? Yeah. And with what Jeff said there, ignorance is no excuse. My people are destroyed for what? You remember what Hosea said? My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Ignorance is no excuse. It was no excuse that's Hosea. Hosea is about 700 years before Christ, so that's the law of Moses. There was no excuse then, and I would say there's even less of an excuse now. We have the total revelation of God's will in the palm of our hands. There's no excuse. ignorance doesn't cut it. Now, we can be ignorant and we can grow out of that. I think of passages like Hebrews chapter 5, verse 12. When for the time you ought to be teachers, you have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God. You're like people who need milk. You're not experienced, you're not aged, you've not spiritually grown up. God will not accept, I didn't mean to, and He won't accept, well, I didn't know. And that's serious. I was thinking, so my sermon this Sunday morning, I've been thinking about this for the past couple of days. I know what I'm going to do. I've got to get it all together in my mind. And I thought that I had, what I'm dealing with is the Christian armor, and my working title right now is The Battlefield of Ideas. All right? Somebody do this for me. Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And I want you to read verses 3 through 5. 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5. Because one idea is, just like Miss Sharon said, to a lot of people in the world, sin isn't sin. We might call it, or we might reframe it as, well, that was a mistake. I made an accident. But, nobody's perfect. We justify, and when I say we, humans in general, tend to justify their bad behavior. It doesn't sound so bad, it doesn't look so bad if I can find some kind of, essentially, excuse. All right, who's got this for me? Go ahead. Bringing into captivity what? Every thought into the obedience of Christ. It matters how you think. And if we think that sin is just no big deal, well, then what's that going to lead to? As a man thinks in his heart, what does the Bible say? So is he. That's why we're told in Proverbs 4, guard your heart. Because out of it, Proverbs 4:23, out of it proceed all the things of life. One thought that I'm going to have in the sermon somewhere, develop it a little bit. You can sit in a church pew for, let's just use a good round number, 10 years. Let's say you do that, all right? 10 years, and you don't miss a service. Okay, so 52 Sundays times 2, that's 104. You got approximately 52 Wednesdays, that's 156, right? What's 156 times 10? Is that 1,560, Jay? 1,600? You can hear 1,600, let's just round it up, 1,600 Bible lessons and not know a thing about the Bible. That's something to think about. I've encountered that. Maybe you've encountered that. Person doesn't miss a service and they don't have a clue about what Scripture teaches. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. If we think that's limited to the days of Hosea, we're kidding ourselves. So when it comes to sin, I think this chapter is important because it teaches that sin is, while we may commit sin intentionally, we'll get to that here in just a second, it is also the case that, Gail read that, I think, James 4, for him who knows to do what's right and does not do it, to him it is sin. Sins of omission. All right. Anything on that before we move to the next point here?
There's also a source of confusion, I think, that a lot of people have. There's a difference between being tempted and sinning. You can be tempted and not sin.
Sure.
But you can also, as it says there, you can sin with your mind.
Yeah. Temptation is not sinful. Thoughts can be sinful. Okay, if you want an example of that. Matthew 5, verses 27 and 28. If you look on a woman to lust after her, what does Jesus say you've done? You've committed adultery with her already in your heart. Now, you've not committed fornication. That's the physical act, but you've committed adultery in your heart. Your thoughts can be sinful, but your thoughts can also lead you to do something physical, and that's James chapter 1. We're drawn away, enticed by our own lusts and desires, and then when that reproduces, it brings forth sin. And sin, when it's finished, what does it produce? Death. The wages of sin is death. So you got James 1, 13 through 16, Romans 6:23, the passage I was referencing, Matthew 5, it's basically verses 27 to 30. So it's a lot to think about. The Christian life is not lived accidentally. It's intentional. Anything else on unintentional sin? Somebody turn over to Psalm 19 and verse 12. That's something, Tammy, I think about. The model prayer, Matthew chapter 6. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Forgiveness needs to be a part of our personal prayer life, absolutely. I don't want this to sound bad. Okay, so just for instance, when I sit down to eat a meal, I don't pray for the forgiveness of sins. But I do in my personal prayers when it's just me. Yeah. All right, what did I say? What are we reading here? Oh, yeah, Psalm 19:12. I think that's the right verse.
Who can understand his error? Cleanse me from secret faults.
Cleanse me from secret faults. We can even try to hide our sins, and that's actually that term there, my hidden sins. So, forgiveness, praying for God's forgiveness just needs to be a part of our prayer life. Is it a sin? Here we go into maybe some speculation. Is it a sin if I don't say every time, okay, I'm going to go to, let's see, it's Wednesday night, 7:35-ish. After this, I'm going to go home and eat something. Do I have to verbalize, if the Lord wills, every time? I don't think so. Is it a good idea? Well, of course. So I think it can be taken to an extreme. And we kind of see that with like the end of this chapter, tassels. The hypocrites in Matthew 23 took things to an extreme. So we'll get there in just a minute. But we can sin without willfully violating some law of God. We can sin unintentionally. Okay, so that's congregational, verses 22 through 26. Well, obviously, if the congregation can do it, an individual can do it. Verses 27 through 29. The King James uses the word and committed by ignorance. Verses 22, 24, and 27, and this applies to all dwellers in Israel equally, Jewish people and strangers. I found this quote and I liked it. Unintentional sin reveals that sin is not merely a matter of conscious rebellion. And that's what I was saying. I'm going to go out, I know what God says, but I'm going to do this anyway. But also includes any deviation from God's standard, whether known or unknown to the congregation or individual. This understanding calls for humility, and maybe, Tammy, this is what, kind of touching on what you were saying. This understanding calls for humility and vigilance among believers, recognizing that human fallibility can lead to sin, even without intent. I don't have to be a vile, wicked sinner to be lost. I don't have to be a murderer, an adulterer, you name it. I can just be, okay, maybe while he did this intentionally, what did the one-talent man do? He did that intentionally, right? But he didn't go out and plunder and pillage, did he? He just didn't do what he was supposed to do. So we need to have a good understanding and appreciation for what sin is and what sin does. And I think chapters like this really can help us get a better grasp on that. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Are we saved by grace? Yeah. I think that's part of that. The grace of God. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
But if you ask for forgiveness every day for the things that you weak at, I mean, you're not really weak if you kind of are tempted and you don't do anything. That shows a lot of strength. But you still think about it.
Well, let me illustrate this for you.
It's hard to control your mind sometimes.
Let me illustrate this. I was just turning in my Bible, our young adults class. We looked at this back, I don't know, probably a couple years ago. I've got a whole page of notes in the back of my Bible on unintentional sin, ignorance. Here are some points from Scripture. Unintentional or ignorant sin could become known. Sacrifice was required. It could be forgiven. But you had to meet the specific terms for that to happen. So, all right. You go out to one of your shows. I'm going to throw you under the bus since you were talking. I'm going to enjoy this. Now, you go out to one of your shows and you're behind your booth selling stuff. And a pretty woman walks by. Is that a sin? I'm not done yet. We got 10 minutes and I'll give an invitation. And pretty woman walks by your booth. It's not a sin for you to look up and say, that's a pretty woman. Now, you're doing your business and this pretty woman walks by and you just fall over your table, watch her. That's a little different. That's intentional. She is really pretty. And you just, there's a difference. Well, good for you. All right. Presumption. Yeah. Unintentional sin. Congregational, unintentional sin. Oh, man. You got one?
Well, I mean,
Here.
if you have a congregation that neglects visitors that come in or whatever, and not intentionally, but not making an effort to go meet them or make them feel welcome, they can feel somewhat isolated or...
Okay. And not just with visitors, but what about your fellow members? We just unkind to one another and here for a couple minutes and I'll see you next Sunday. I think that can be a sinful attitude. And it's not, you're not walking into the building thinking, you know what, I'm going to go here and I'm not going to talk to anybody. It's just rote Christianity, right? I think does that work, Joe? Oh. Well, here's another one I was thinking of. I think congregations can sin unintentionally through ignorance of the Scriptures. Now, that can also happen intentionally. Because how many times have we heard of congregations changing their views on instrumental music and women's roles specifically by saying, we've spent about 6 months restudying this topic and we're going to put some women deacons up. Or we're going to add a female pastor to it. That is absolutely happening within churches of Christ. All right, what do you got? I think you could. Hmm. Yeah. I think you could. But at the same time, here's what I'm thinking. At the same time, that's not how you treat sin that you've committed. Like, I've heard people come forward and confess before, well, if I have ever committed any sin, I'm using a little hyperbole here. If I've ever committed any sin, anytime, anywhere, and I might need forgiveness, then please forgive me. Okay, that's not how that works. Yeah, but I would like to think in terms of like the new covenant and biblical knowledge, that shouldn't be happening. I would like to think that. I'll say it that way. Oh, absolutely. Unintentionally sinning? Yeah. Yeah. If they repented of what they were doing, they can be forgiven. But there again, ignorance. If you never hear sermons, for instance, or Bible classes on, what I just mentioned earlier, women's roles, all right? Because that is a big movement across Christendom in general. It's also within churches of Christ. But if the preacher never preaches on it, well, that's on him. If the elders never say, hey, you need to preach on this, that's on them. But what do the rest of you got? How many of the congregants would be studying women's role in the public assembly of the church? Probably not too many. Well, that might be what you call top-down sin. But the folks in the crowd aren't intentionally violating God's will. They're just ignorant. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's what I was saying earlier, like losing your temper. You're not acting like Christ in that moment. Now, you can get angry without sinning, but, what we're... Yeah. 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 Right. I don't know how to answer that, to be honest with you. I really don't. Yeah. Yeah, I know. I know what you're saying. And I don't know how to answer that question. I really don't. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Psalm 119:11. I've treasured your word in my heart that I may not sin against you.
Yeah.
We just be, just continually search the scriptures daily to try to find God's will for us, and any shortcomings that may happen that we don't know about will be covered by God's grace.
If any man wills to do his will, he can know the doctrine. John 7:17. You mentioned Psalm 119:11. Yep. Thy word have I hid in my heart that I might not sin against thee. Okay, so we didn't finish Numbers 15, so we'll pick up there next week and hit it and 16.